Most relationships don't fail because of betrayal, arguments, or distance. They fail quietly when two people stop understanding themselves. We often believe relationships collapse because of the other person, but the deeper truth is this: relationships fail when unconscious patterns meet unmet awareness. Love does not end suddenly. It fades when understanding is replaced by expectation. Most people do not enter relationships to share love. They enter them to escape themselves. Beneath the romance, the attraction, and the promise of togetherness, there is often a quiet expectation: you will make me whole. This expectation is rarely spoken, yet it shapes the entire relationship. When we feel incomplete inside, we unconsciously search for another person to fill the space we have not learned to sit with. What begins as connection slowly becomes dependency. This is where relationships start to fracture, not through conflict, but through pressure. When another human being is treated as a solution, they are burdened with a task no one can fulfill. No person can heal your unexamined wounds, resolve your inner emptiness, or give you a sense of identity. When love is asked to compensate for self-neglect, it collapses under the weight. The illusion is subtle. We call it love, but it is often a form of escape. We cling not because we deeply understand one another, but because being alone feels unbearable. And so the relationship becomes a refuge from silence, a distraction from self-reflection. Over time, affection is replaced by need, and need quietly transforms into resentment. True connection does not arise from lack, it arises from wholeness. When two individuals come together not to complete each other, but to share themselves, love flows naturally. There is space, freedom, and curiosity. But when one partner becomes responsible for the emotional stability of the other, intimacy turns into obligation. This is why so many relationships feel suffocating. The problem is not love, it is the expectation that love should save us from ourselves. We are taught to believe that happiness exists somewhere outside us, waiting in the form of another person. But this belief guarantees disappointment, because the moment the other fails to deliver constant fulfillment, frustration emerges. When you seek completion in another, you lose yourself. You begin to adjust, suppress, and perform in order to maintain the bond. Authenticity fades, and fear of loss replaces joy. The relationship no longer becomes a meeting of two beings, but a negotiation for emotional survival. Paradoxically, love becomes strongest when you no longer need it to survive. When you learn to sit with your own emptiness, to understand it rather than escape it, something changes. You stop demanding and start relating. You stop clinging and start sharing. Love becomes an expression, not a requirement. Connection is not about being saved, it is about being seen. And you cannot be truly seen until you are willing to see yourself. Have you ever realized that you were seeking completion in a relationship instead of connection? Share your insight in the comments. Your awareness could help someone else break the same cycle. Love begins quietly, not with demands, not with promises, but with attention. In the beginning of a relationship, presence is natural. Two people listen deeply, notice small details, and remain curious about one another. There is space to discover, to observe, to simply be together without the need to control the outcome. This presence is what makes love feel alive. But slowly, almost invisibly, presence is replaced by expectation. Expectations are subtle demands disguised as hope. They sound innocent. You should understand me. You should make me feel secure. You should always be there. Yet each expectation pulls us out of the present moment and into a mental image of how the other ought to be. When we compare reality to expectation, disappointment becomes inevitable. Love suffers not because people change, but because we stop allowing change. We cling to past versions of the person we love, expecting consistency in a world defined by movement. When expectations harden, curiosity fades. We stop listening and start assuming. We no longer see the person in front of us. We see our projection of them. Presence requires openness. Expectation requires control. And control suffocates intimacy. When expectations dominate a relationship, connection turns into negotiation. Every interaction becomes measured against an invisible standard. Appreciation is replaced by judgment, and gratitude is replaced by entitlement. Instead of asking, "Who are you becoming?" we demand, "Why aren't you who I want you to be?" This shift changes the emotional atmosphere of the relationship. Love feels heavy. Conversations feel tense. silence feels threatening. And yet, the tragedy is that nothing dramatic has happened. What has been lost is simple awareness, the willingness to meet the other person as they are, not as we imagine them to be. True presence means observing without immediately reacting. It means listening without preparing a response. It means allowing space for imperfection, growth, and uncertainty. Presence invites connection because it removes the pressure to perform. Expectations, on the other hand, are rooted in fear of loss, fear of change, fear of discomfort. They are attempts to secure love rather than experience it. But love cannot be secured. The tighter we grip it, the faster it slips away. When you return to presence, something softens. You begin to see the other person again, not as a role, not as a source of fulfillment, but as a living, changing being. And in that seeing, love breathes again. Presence is not passive. It is an active choice to meet life as it unfolds. When we choose presence over expectation, connection deepens, and love regains its natural flow. Have expectations ever damaged a relationship in your life? What changed when you chose presence instead? Share your reflection in the comments. Your awareness may help someone else reconnect. Most people fear loneliness more than they fear losing themselves. And so, attachment quietly replaces love. Loneliness is not the absence of others, it is the discomfort of being alone with oneself. When this discomfort goes unexamined, it shapes relationships in subtle and powerful ways. What we often call love is, at times, simply the fear of being left unseen or unneeded. Attachment grows where understanding has not yet matured. Attachment feels intense, urgent, and consuming. It clings, monitors, and demands reassurance. Love, on the other hand, is spacious. It allows freedom, but fear does not allow space. Fear tightens its grip, believing that closeness will dissolve insecurity. In reality, fear magnifies it. When attachment is driven by loneliness, relationships become contracts for emotional survival. The unspoken agreement is simple: stay, and I will feel safe. Yet no relationship can permanently protect us from the experience of aloneness. When this expectation is placed on another, tension grows. The partner becomes a shield against inner emptiness, and any distance, emotional or physical, feels threatening. This is why attachment often masquerades as devotion. It imitates care, commitment, and passion. But beneath the surface, it is fueled by anxiety. The more one clings, the more one fears loss. And the more one fears loss, the less one can truly love. True love does not arise from fear of absence. It arises from comfort with presence, especially the presence of oneself. When you are at ease in your own company, you no longer grasp at others to complete you. You choose connection rather than depend on it. Fear-based attachment also distorts perception. It interprets independence as rejection, silence as abandonment, and change as danger. The partner is no longer seen clearly, but through the lens of insecurity. This creates misunderstandings, emotional volatility, and exhaustion on both sides. The paradox is that the more we cling, the more fragile the bond becomes. Love needs freedom to breathe. Attachment suffocates it with fear. When fear governs a relationship, understanding fades, and control attempts to take its place. Loneliness, when faced directly, becomes a teacher. It invites self-knowledge, reflection, and inner stability. But when avoided, it drives us to cling to others for validation and safety. Growth begins not when we eliminate loneliness, but when we stop running from it. When you learn to sit with your own solitude without fear, relationships transform. You no longer seek someone to escape loneliness, you choose someone to share life with. Love becomes an offering, not a necessity. Have you ever confused attachment with love? What changed when you learned to be comfortable with your own solitude? Share your experience in the comments. Your insight could help someone else find clarity. We do not fall in love with people as they are. We fall in love with who we imagine them to be. In the early stages of a relationship, imagination is powerful. We see fragments of a person and complete the picture ourselves. Our hopes, desires, and unfulfilled longings quietly fill in the gaps. This projection feels magical. It creates intensity, excitement, and meaning. But it is not yet love, it is interpretation. Projection is not deception. It is unconscious creation. We project our need for understanding, security, or excitement onto another and believe we have found it. The other person becomes a mirror reflecting our inner world. As long as reality aligns with imagination, harmony exists. But reality does not remain still. Over time, the person reveals their complexity, their limits, fears, contradictions, and individuality. And this is where resentment begins, not because they have changed, but because our projection has been challenged. We feel disappointed not by who they are, but by who they are not. Resentment grows quietly. It often disguises itself as criticism. You're not as attentive as before. You've changed. You're not who I fell in love with. What is rarely acknowledged is that the image we loved was partially our own creation. The conflict arises when we demand reality to match imagination. Projection removes presence. Instead of seeing the person in front of us, we compare them to an inner image. This comparison creates distance. The more tightly we cling to the projection, the more we resist the truth of who the other person actually is. Love matures when projection dissolves. True intimacy begins not with idealization, but with acceptance. It requires letting go of fantasy and meeting reality without judgment. This can feel like loss, but it is actually the beginning of real connection. When we stop projecting, we stop resenting. We begin to listen instead of assuming. We observe instead of demanding. The relationship becomes less dramatic but more authentic. Love becomes quieter, deeper, and more stable. Projection is comforting because it allows us to avoid uncertainty. Reality demands humility. It asks us to accept imperfection not only in others, but in ourselves. When we recognize our projections, we reclaim responsibility for our expectations. Resentment is not caused by the other person. It is caused by the collision between fantasy and truth. When we understand this, conflict becomes a doorway to awareness rather than blame. To love is not to insist that someone fulfill your imagination. It is to meet them where they are, without illusion, and choose to stay present. Have you ever realized that resentment came from unmet expectations rather than real harm? Share your reflection in the comments. Your insight may help someone see their relationship more clearly. At first, communication is honest. Later, it becomes careful. And eventually, it becomes performance. In the early moments of connection, people speak freely. Words flow without calculation. There is curiosity, openness, and a willingness to be misunderstood. But as attachment deepens, something subtle changes. The desire to be accepted begins to outweigh the courage to be authentic. Communication shifts, not because love fades, but because fear quietly enters. Instead of speaking truth, we begin to manage impressions. We choose words not to express reality, but to preserve harmony. Silence replaces honesty. We avoid discomfort, believing that peace means agreement. But peace built on suppression is fragile. When communication becomes performance, conversations lose depth. We say what is safe instead of what is true. We present a version of ourselves designed to maintain approval. Over time, this performance becomes exhausting. The relationship no longer feels like a meeting of two people, but a stage where roles must be maintained. Authentic communication requires vulnerability. It invites the risk of disagreement, misunderstanding, and even rejection. Performance avoids risk by hiding behind politeness and emotional restraint. But what is hidden does not disappear. It accumulates. Unspoken thoughts turn into quiet resentment. Suppressed emotions leak out through tone, distance, and passive conflict. This is why many relationships feel confusing. Arguments are not about the surface issue, they are about what was never said. The real conversation is always happening beneath the words. When approval becomes more important than authenticity, intimacy weakens. The relationship may appear stable, but it lacks aliveness. True connection cannot exist without truth, and truth cannot survive where fear of judgment dominates. To speak honestly does not mean to speak harshly. It means to speak from awareness rather than defense. Authentic communication listens as much as it expresses. It does not aim to win, it aims to understand. Performance creates masks. Authenticity removes them. And when masks fall, there is relief. Conversations become lighter. Misunderstandings become opportunities rather than threats. Love regains its fluidity. The irony is that honesty strengthens connection more than approval ever could. When people feel safe to express their inner reality, trust deepens. Even conflict becomes meaningful because it is real. Communication is not about saying the right thing, it is about being real in the moment. When we stop performing and start expressing, relationships shift from fragile to resilient. Have you ever noticed yourself performing instead of speaking honestly in a relationship? What changed when you chose authenticity instead of approval? Share your reflection in the comments. Your voice may help someone find the courage to speak truth. Growth is welcomed until it changes the balance, and then it becomes frightening. At the beginning of a relationship, growth feels exciting. Two people inspire each other, encourage change, and dream together. But as time passes, growth begins to challenge familiarity. When one person evolves, while the other remains attached to what was, tension quietly enters the space between them. Growth disrupts comfort. It questions roles, routines, and unspoken agreements. When one partner changes, becomes more aware, more confident, more independent, it can feel like loss to the other, not because love has diminished, but because certainty has. Resistance to growth often appears as concern. You're different now. You've changed. These words are rarely accusations, they are expressions of fear. Fear that the connection will shift. Fear that what was once familiar will no longer be enough. Love that depends on sameness cannot survive transformation. Relationships that demand stagnation eventually suffocate the individuals within them. Growth is not betrayal, it is a natural movement of life. When growth is discouraged, love becomes conditional. The deeper truth is this: growth exposes insecurity. When one grows, the other is invited, sometimes unwillingly, to reflect. This reflection can be uncomfortable. It challenges identity, habits, and beliefs. Instead of embracing the invitation, many resist it. When growth becomes threatening, communication tightens, support turns into control, encouragement becomes criticism. The relationship shifts from collaboration to competition, not because people intend harm, but because fear is quietly steering behavior. Love does not require two people to grow at the same pace, but it does require mutual respect for growth itself. When growth is honored, differences become enriching rather than divisive. When growth is feared, change feels dangerous. True love allows evolution. It understands that no one remains static. It invites curiosity instead of control. It asks, "Who are you becoming?" instead of "Why aren't you who you were?" Growth does not mean leaving, it means becoming more fully yourself. When both partners allow this, the relationship becomes a living process rather than a fixed structure. Love matures not by staying the same, but by adapting with awareness. Stagnation may feel safe, but it is ultimately destructive. Growth may feel unsettling, but it brings vitality. Love that grows stays alive. Love that resists change slowly fades. Have you ever experienced tension when growth entered a relationship? Were you the one changing or the one resisting? Share your insight in the comments. Your reflection could help someone understand their situation more clearly. Conflict is inevitable in relationships. How we respond to it determines whether love thrives or withers. Many relationships fail not because people hurt each other, but because responsibility is avoided. When tension arises, the instinct is often to blame the other person, to point outward rather than inward. Blame feels easier than reflection. It gives the illusion of control. It's their fault, not mine. Yet, this illusion is fragile. When we avoid responsibility, conflict does not resolve, it festers. Avoiding responsibility turns small disagreements into recurring patterns. Words become weapons, silence becomes punishment, misunderstandings multiply. Love slowly feels like a battlefield because no one is willing to look at their own contribution. Reflection is uncomfortable. It requires humility, self awareness, and the courage to admit, "I am part of this." Blame requires none of that, and so it becomes a habit. True intimacy requires shared responsibility, not to assign guilt, but to understand dynamics. When one person reflects, the other often mirrors. When both examine their roles in a conflict, communication deepens. What was once tension becomes insight. What was once accusation becomes curiosity. Resolution begins when self responsibility is embraced. Responsibility in relationships is not about control or perfection. It is about awareness. It is recognizing that our words, actions, and reactions shape the environment we share with another. Avoiding this awareness allows resentment to grow. Taking responsibility allows connection to grow. Blame creates separation. Reflection creates understanding. When we consistently avoid our part, we reinforce a cycle of frustration. Arguments repeat themselves, sometimes for years, until one or both partners either change or leave. Growth is impossible when responsibility is rejected. Taking responsibility is not weakness, it is power. It frees us from the illusion that we are helpless victims of circumstance. When we acknowledge our part, we reclaim agency over how we feel, how we respond, and how we engage. We also invite our partner to do the same, creating a space where trust, empathy, and love can flourish. Relationships demand accountability, not in the form of judgment, but in the form of honest reflection. When conflict arises, pause before reacting. Ask yourself, what part of this belongs to me? How did I contribute? What can I learn? This practice transforms tension into teaching. It transforms frustration into clarity. It transforms relationships into mirrors of growth. Avoiding responsibility is easy, facing it is courageous. But it is only through courage that love survives and deepens. Without responsibility, connection becomes fragile and conflict remains unresolved. With responsibility, love becomes resilient. Have you noticed times when avoiding responsibility damaged a relationship? What changed when you took ownership instead of blaming? Share your experience in the comments. Your reflection could help someone else navigate their relationships more wisely. Love is often mistaken for emotion. We think that as long as we feel strongly, love will endure. But emotion alone is fleeting, intense one day, fading the next. Passion can inspire, but it cannot sustain. Without awareness, love becomes fragile, unpredictable, and eventually unsustainable. Awareness is the quiet foundation beneath emotion. It is the conscious observation of yourself, your partner, and the relationship as a living, evolving system. Awareness notices patterns, acknowledges discomfort, and recognizes the subtle shifts in connection. It allows you to respond rather than react, to understand rather than assume. Love sustained by awareness is steady. It endures even when feelings fluctuate. Without awareness, love drifts into assumptions. We assume our partner knows what we need, or that they will remain as they are. We assume we can rely on emotion to carry the weight of challenges. But life is dynamic. People grow, circumstances shift, and emotions change. When we ignore these realities, love becomes a fragile arrangement of hopes and expectations, vulnerable to disappointment. Awareness is not passive observation, it is active engagement with reality. It means recognizing your own fears, insecurities, and patterns, and seeing your partner with clarity and curiosity. It involves asking, what am I feeling? What are you feeling? What is this relationship asking of us? This mindful attention transforms ordinary interactions into opportunities for connection, understanding, and deep intimacy. Love without awareness is blind. It cannot adapt to change, cannot navigate conflict, and cannot appreciate growth. Awareness keeps the relationship alive because it allows both partners to respond to reality rather than cling to illusions. It replaces reaction with reflection and judgment with understanding. Awareness also nurtures gratitude. When we truly see the other person not through the lens of expectation or projection, but as they truly are, love deepens. We begin to notice not only their actions, but the subtleties, the small gestures, the quiet consistency, the ways they adapt and grow. Appreciation becomes natural, and resentment diminishes. Furthermore, awareness allows us to hold space for imperfection, both ours and theirs. Love is not about finding a flawless being. It is about embracing the complexity of another human, recognizing both their strengths and weaknesses. It is the willingness to stay present, even when emotions fluctuate, challenges arise, or growth pushes us into discomfort. Ultimately, love sustained by awareness is resilient. It transforms challenges into lessons, conflict into clarity, and ordinary moments into connection. It is no longer dependent on fleeting feelings, but rooted in conscious engagement with life, self, and partner. Have you ever realized that awareness, not emotion, is what kept a relationship alive? Share your reflection in the comments. Your insight could help someone understand what truly sustains love.